The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of palace as Prince Alexander hurried through the grand corridors, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. He had been searching for hours, turning over every cushion, rifling through every drawer in Princess Isabella's private chambers. The letter had to be somewhere. Isabella had mentioned it in her final days, speaking in whispers about something important she had written, something that would change everything. Alexander's hands trembled as he recalled his wife's last moments 3 months ago. She had been lying in their bed, pale and weak from the illness that had ravaged her body for nearly a year. Her green eyes, once so bright and full of life, had dimmed to a whisper of their former brilliance. She had reached for his hand with what little strength remained and spoken in barely audible words. "Alexander, there's something you must know. I wrote it all down, the truth about everything. Promise me you'll find it when I'm gone. Promise me you'll read it, no matter what anyone tells you." He had promised, of course. How could he refuse the dying wish of the woman he had loved more than life itself? But now, months later, despite countless searches through their shared quarters, he had found nothing. The palace staff claimed they knew nothing about any letter. Even Isabella's personal maid, who had served her faithfully for 15 years, insisted she had never seen any such document. The frustration was eating away at Alexander like acid. He barely slept anymore, barely ate. His royal duties suffered as he became increasingly obsessed with finding Isabella's final message. The kingdom's advisors whispered among themselves, concerned about their prince's mental state. Some suggested he seek help from the royal physicians, while others wondered if the grief had simply driven him mad. Queen, Alexander's stepmother, watched his decline with what appeared to be genuine concern. She had married Alexander's father, King Edmund, when Alexander was barely 10 years old, after his biological mother had died in a riding accident. Had always been kind to him, treating him as her own son, and she had grown particularly close to Isabella during her marriage to Alexander. "My dear boy," would say, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder whenever she found him searching frantically through rooms. "Isabella was very ill at the end. Sometimes in our final moments we say things that aren't quite real. Perhaps this letter exists only in grief's imagination." But Alexander couldn't accept that explanation. Isabella had been weak, yes, but her mind had remained sharp until the very end. She had been lucid when she spoke about the letter, desperate even. There had been an urgency in her voice that suggested whatever she had written was of tremendous importance. The palace itself seemed to conspire against his search. Was ancient, built over centuries by different kings, each adding their own wings and secret passages. There were rooms within rooms, hidden compartments behind paintings, and corridors that led to nowhere. Isabella could have hidden a letter anywhere within its walls, and it might remain lost forever. As weeks turned into months, Alexander began to notice things that had escaped his attention during the immediate aftermath of Isabella's death. Small inconsistencies in the stories people told about her final days. The way certain servants would quickly change the subject when he asked about Isabella's last weeks. Most troubling of all was the way Queen's expression would shift, just for a moment, whenever the letter was mentioned. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Alexander had learned to read faces during his years of royal training. One evening, as autumn rain lashed against the palace windows, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He would search Queen's private chambers. The thought felt like betrayal even as it formed in his mind. Had been nothing but supportive since Isabella's death, offering comfort and guidance when he needed it most. But something deep in his gut told him that she knew more than she was letting on. The opportunity came during the harvest festival, when would be occupied for hours with the traditional ceremonies in the Great Hall. Alexander waited until the sounds of celebration echoed from below, then made his way to the Queen's quarters in the East Wing. His heart pounded as he approached her private study, a room he had only entered a handful of times in his adult life. The study was immaculate, as always, was a woman of precise habits, everything in its proper place. Her desk was clear except for a single leather-bound journal and an ornate letter opener. Lined the walls, filled with volumes on history, politics, and royal protocol. Alexander began his search methodically, checking drawers, looking behind paintings, examining the books for any hidden compartments. It was pure chance that led him to the discovery. As he pulled out a heavy volume on medieval law, something fluttered to the floor. A piece of parchment, folded small and yellowed with age. But this wasn't what made his breath catch in his throat. Hidden behind the fallen parchment, wedged between two books, was an envelope bearing his name in Isabella's distinctive handwriting. Alexander's hands shook as he pulled the letter free. The envelope was sealed with red wax, impressed with Isabella's personal seal, a small rose surrounded by thorns. As he held it up to the lamplight, he could see that it contained several pages of closely written text. This was it. This was what Isabella had been trying to tell him about. But why was it in Queen's study? How had it gotten there? The questions in his mind as he clutched the letter to his chest. Part of him wanted to tear it open immediately, but another part feared what he might learn. Isabella had spoken of truth, of something that would change everything. What secrets had his beloved wife taken to her grave, and why had someone gone to such lengths to keep them from him? The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made Alexander's blood freeze. Someone was coming. He quickly tucked the letter inside his jacket and moved toward the door, trying to appear casual. As he stepped into the hallway, he came face to face with Queen herself, resplendent in her festival robes, but with an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to something else. Something that might have been fear. "Alexander," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "What brings you to this part of the palace during the celebrations?" "I was looking for you, actually," he lied smoothly, though his heart hammered against his ribs where Isabella's letter lay hidden. "I wanted to thank you for organizing such a beautiful ceremony for Isabella's memorial garden." His eyes searched his face, and for a moment, Alexander thought she might see through his deception. But then she smiled, the same warm smile she had given him countless times throughout his life. "Of course, my dear. Isabella would have loved to see how the roses are blooming. She always said they were her favorite flowers." As they walked back toward the great hall together, Alexander felt the weight of the letter against his chest like a burning coal. Soon, very soon, he would learn what Isabella had been so desperate to tell him. And somehow, he sensed that once he read those pages, nothing in his world would ever be the same again. Alexander waited until the palace fell into the deep silence of early morning before returning to his chambers. The festival had continued well into the night, giving him ample time to maintain his facade of normalcy, while his mind raced with possibilities about Isabella's hidden letter. Now, finally alone in the privacy of his room, he pulled the envelope from inside his jacket with trembling fingers. The wax seal broke with a soft crack that seemed to echo in the quiet chamber. Alexander unfolded the pages carefully, recognizing immediately Isabella's flowing script, though it appeared more hurried and desperate than her usual careful penmanship. As his eyes fell upon the first lines, his breath caught in his throat. "My dearest Alexander, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I pray that means my suspicions died with me. But I fear they did not, which is why I must tell you everything, even if it destroys the peace you might have found in my absence." Alexander's hands shook as he continued reading. Isabella's words painted a picture so shocking, so utterly devastating, that he had to stop several times to steady himself. She wrote of overhearing conversations she was never meant to hear, of discovering documents hidden in places where they should never have been found. Most damning of all, she revealed the truth about her own illness. "The sickness that is taking my life was no accident of nature, my beloved. I have proof that it was induced slowly, carefully, over many months. The symptoms began shortly after I discovered certain financial irregularities in the royal accounts. Money that should have gone to the people's welfare was being diverted elsewhere. When I began asking questions, when I started investigating, that was when the headaches began. Then the weakness. Then the terrible pain that the physicians claimed was some rare blood disorder." Alexander's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. His Isabella, his beautiful, intelligent, compassionate Isabella, had been murdered. And not quickly, but slowly, agonizingly, over months of suffering that he had watched helplessly, never knowing that someone was deliberately poisoning her. But the revelation that followed was even more devastating. Isabella had discovered who was behind not just her murder, but a web of corruption that reached to the very heart of the kingdom. The person responsible had been stealing from the royal treasury for years, embezzling funds meant for hospitals, schools, and aid to the poor. When Isabella had stumbled upon the evidence, she had signed her own death warrant. "I know you will find this impossible to believe, as I did when I first discovered the truth. The person responsible is someone we both trust completely, someone who has been like a mother to you and a dear friend to me. But I have seen the documents with my own eyes, hidden in a secret compartment behind the mirror in her private study. Queen has been systematically stealing from our people while presenting herself as their devoted protector." Alexander's world tilted on its axis. Queen, the woman who had raised him, who had comforted him through Isabella's illness, who had been the picture of maternal love and royal duty for over 2 decades. The accusation seemed impossible, insane even. Yet as he continued reading Isabella's meticulous documentation of evidence, bank records, and overheard conversations, a terrible picture began to emerge. Had been using her position to funnel money into private accounts, claiming the funds were for various charitable endeavors that existed only on paper. She had been working with corrupt officials in distant provinces, creating fake contracts and phantom projects. The scale of the theft was staggering enough money to feed thousands of families, to build schools and hospitals, to improve the lives of countless citizens who had instead suffered while their queen lived in luxury. But the financial crimes were only part of the horror. Isabella's letter revealed that she had not been his first victim. Alexander's own mother, Queen Victoria, had not died in a riding accident as everyone believed. She too had been asking questions, investigating irregularities she had noticed in the kingdom's finances. Her horse had been drugged, her saddle sabotaged. The accident that had left 10-year-old Alexander motherless had been carefully orchestrated murder. I know this will break your heart, my darling, as it has broken mine. The woman who has been your mother figure, who comforted you after Victoria's death, who helped raise you into the good man you are today, is the same person who arranged that death. She killed your mother to protect her secrets, and now she has killed me for the same reason. Alexander collapsed into his chair, the letter falling from nerveless fingers. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, his kingdom was a lie. The woman he had called mother for most of his life was a murderer and a thief. The deaths of the 2 women he had loved most in the world were on her hands. As dawn light began to filter through the chamber windows, Alexander forced himself to finish reading Isabella's letter. She had hidden copies of all the evidence in a secret location, documented in her final paragraphs. But more importantly, she had discovered that was planning something even more terrible. With Alexander consumed by grief and seemingly losing his grip on reality, was positioning herself to claim regency over the kingdom. She had been spreading rumors about his mental instability, gathering support from corrupt nobles who benefited from her criminal network. She means to rule through you, my love, and if you prove too difficult to control, I fear you may suffer the same fate as your mother, and I trust no one in the palace. The corruption runs deeper than I was able to discover in the time I had left. Guard yourself, and when you are ready, use the evidence I have gathered to expose the truth to our people. The final lines of the letter were smeared, as if tears had fallen on the ink as Isabella wrote them. I am so sorry to leave you with this burden, Alexander. I am sorry that I must destroy your faith in someone you love. But our people deserve better than to be ruled by a murderer and a thief. Promise me you will see justice done, not for my sake, but for theirs. All my love, always and forever, Isabella. Alexander sat in the growing daylight, his mind reeling. How could he have been so blind? Looking back now, he could see signs he had missed. The way had been so quick to dismiss his search for the letter. Her subtle suggestions that his grief was making him irrational. The concerned conversations with palace officials about his fitness to rule. She had been laying the groundwork for his removal from power while pretending to care for his. A soft knock at his chamber door made him start. He quickly gathered the pages of Isabella's letter, folding them carefully and tucking them into a hidden pocket inside his doublet. When he opened the door, he found Queen herself standing in the corridor, dressed in a simple morning gown, her face arranged in an expression of motherly concern. Alexander, my dear boy, she said softly, I've been worried about you. You seemed distracted at the festival last night, and I know these past months have been so difficult. I thought perhaps we might have breakfast together, just the 2 of us, like we used to when you were young. Looking at her now, knowing what he knew, Alexander felt sick to his stomach. But he also felt something else growing within him, a cold, determined anger. This woman had murdered his mother, murdered his wife, stolen from his people, and now stood before him wearing a mask of loving concern. She thought him weak, thought grief had made him malleable and easy to control. That would be wonderful, Mother, he said, using the title that now tasted like ash in his mouth. I think it's time we had a long conversation about many things. Smile was warm and seemingly genuine, but Alexander caught something else in her eyes now that he knew to look for it. A calculating coldness that had always been there, hidden beneath her maternal facade. As they walked toward the private dining chamber together, Alexander began planning his next move. Isabella had died to bring him the truth, and now he would honor her sacrifice by ensuring that justice was finally served. The private dining chamber felt smaller than usual as Alexander sat across from Queen, watching her pour tea with the same graceful movements he had observed since childhood. The morning light streaming through the tall windows illuminated her face, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the loving stepmother who had bandaged his scraped knees and read him bedtime stories. The dichotomy between that memory and the truth Isabella had revealed made his stomach churn. "You look pale, darling," said, her voice filled with what seemed like genuine concern. "Are you sleeping at all? Perhaps doctor should prescribe something to help with the nightmares." Alexander forced himself to maintain eye contact, knowing that every word, every gesture was now part of a deadly game. "I've been having trouble sleeping, yes, but not because of nightmares. I've been thinking about Isabella's final days, trying to remember every conversation we had." Something flickered across face, so brief that Alexander might have missed it if he hadn't been watching so carefully. It was there and gone in an instant, but it was enough. Fear. She was afraid of what Isabella might have told him. "My dear boy," said, reaching across the table to pat his hand, "you mustn't torture yourself with such thoughts. Isabella's mind was affected by the illness near the end. You know how these blood disorders can cause confusion, even hallucinations." The casual dismissal of Isabella's mental state, the same argument had been making for months, now rang completely differently in Alexander's ears. She wasn't trying to comfort him. She was trying to discredit anything Isabella might have said. Alexander pulled his hand away gently, as if the touch had become uncomfortable rather than suspicious. "Actually, I wanted to ask you about something specific," he said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. "Isabella mentioned a letter she had written. She seemed to think it was very important." His teacup rattled slightly as she set it down. The sound was barely audible, but Alexander caught it. "A letter? I'm afraid I don't know anything about that." As I said, her mind was quite clouded toward the end. "But if such a letter existed," Alexander pressed, "and if Isabella had hidden it somewhere in the palace, where do you think she might have put it? You knew her habits better than anyone." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Smile remained in place, but Alexander could see tension creeping into the lines around her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried just a hint of sharpness. "Alexander, this obsession with finding something that probably doesn't exist is becoming unhealthy. Perhaps it's time to consider that your grief is affecting your judgment." There it was again, the subtle suggestion that his mental state was questionable. Alexander realized this was likely how it had started with his mother, too. Questions about her behavior, concerns about her stability, laying the groundwork for people to accept her eventual accident as the tragic result of an unstable woman's reckless actions. "You're probably right," Alexander said, allowing defeat to creep into his voice. "I just miss her so much. Sometimes I feel like she's trying to tell me something, but I know that's impossible." Smile became more genuine, believing she had successfully redirected his thoughts. "Of course you miss her, darling. She was a wonderful woman, but she's at peace now, and you need to focus on the future. The kingdom needs you to be strong." As if summoned by her words, Lord Chancellor Blackwood entered the dining chamber, bowing formally before approaching their table. Alexander had never liked Blackwood. There was something oily about the man's perpetual smile, and the way he always seemed to be listening at doors. Now, reading the silent communication that passed between Blackwood and Alexander realized the Chancellor was likely part of the corruption Isabella had discovered. "Your Majesty, Your Highness," Blackwood said smoothly, "forgive the interruption, but there are several urgent matters that require Prince Alexander's attention. The Council is concerned about some irregularities in recent royal decisions." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. This was it, the beginning of the campaign to remove him from power. They were moving faster than he had expected, which meant they might suspect he knew something. "What kind of irregularities?" Alexander asked, genuine curiosity mixing with his growing alarm. Blackwood exchanged another look with before answering. "Nothing serious, Your Highness, but there have been questions about your recent isolation, your difficulties in handling state business. Some of the nobles are wondering if the grief has perhaps affected your capacity to rule effectively." The trap was being laid out in front of him with stunning boldness. Alexander realized that his months of searching for Isabella's letter, his obvious distress and preoccupation, had been interpreted as evidence of mental instability. They were going to use his genuine grief against him. "I see," Alexander said carefully, And what does the council propose? Nothing drastic, interjected quickly. Perhaps a temporary regency, just until you've had time to properly heal from your loss. I would be honored to shoulder that burden for you, my son. There it was, the endgame Isabella had predicted, positioning herself as the grieving mother figure, reluctantly accepting power to protect a mentally unstable prince. The kingdom would accept it because it seemed reasonable, even noble. And once she had official power, Alexander's life expectancy would likely be measured in weeks rather than years. That's very generous, Alexander said, standing from the table. I should think about this carefully. May I have some time to consider the council's concerns? Of course, said, rising as well. Her relief at his reasonable response was visible. Take all the time you need. We only want what's best for you and the kingdom. Alexander left the dining chamber with measured steps, maintaining his facade until he was well out of sight. Then he moved quickly through the palace corridors, his mind racing. He needed to act fast, but he also needed to be smart. Had spent years building her network of corruption, she would have allies throughout the palace, people who would report his movements. Following Isabella's detailed instructions, Alexander made his way to the old castle tower, a part of the palace that had been abandoned for decades. Hidden behind a loose stone in the tower's foundation, exactly where Isabella had said it would be, he found a leather satchel containing dozens of documents. Bank records, forged contracts, correspondence between and her co-conspirators, everything needed to prove the scope of her crimes. But as Alexander examined the evidence, he realized something that made his blood run cold. Among the papers was a draft letter in handwriting outlining plans for his own accidental death. She had been planning to poison him just as she had Isabella, but slowly, so it would appear to be a suicide brought on by grief and mental instability. The sound of footsteps echoing in the tower made Alexander freeze. Someone was coming up the narrow stairs. He quickly stuffed the documents back into the satchel and looked for an escape route, but the tower had only one entrance. He was trapped. Queen appeared at the top of the stairs, but she was no longer wearing her mask of maternal concern. Her face was cold, calculating, and in her hand was a small crossbow, the kind used for hunting small game but deadly enough at close range. I really hoped it wouldn't come to this, she said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. You were always such a sweet boy, Alexander. Even after you started asking inconvenient questions, I kept hoping you would simply accept Isabella's death and move on. You killed her, Alexander said, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. You killed my mother, too. Sighed almost sadly. Victoria was getting too close to the truth, just like Isabella. I couldn't allow that. And yes, Isabella's death was necessary. She was quite clever, unfortunately, too clever for her own good. The people will know, Alexander said, clutching the satchel. I have evidence of everything. Evidence that will disappear along with you, replied. The grieving prince, driven mad by loss, taking his own life in the abandoned tower where he and his beloved wife once met for secret trysts. Very romantic, very tragic. The kingdom will mourn you properly. But as raised the crossbow, Alexander heard something that made his heart leap with hope, the sound of many footsteps on the tower stairs. The palace guards appeared behind, led by Captain, the one man in the palace Alexander had always trusted completely. Your Majesty, said formally to, please lower your weapon. Spun around, her face a mask of confusion and outrage. Captain, what is the meaning of this? Prince Alexander has been behaving erratically. I came here to ensure his safety. We received an interesting message this morning, replied calmly. A letter, supposedly from the late Princess Isabella, detailing certain accusations. Prince Alexander arranged for it to be delivered to several trusted allies simultaneously, along with instructions to act if anything happened to him. Alexander felt a surge of relief and gratitude toward Isabella that brought tears to his eyes. Even in death, she had protected him by forcing him to protect himself. The letter he had found included detailed instructions for exactly this scenario. As the guards moved to arrest, her composure finally cracked. The mask of royal dignity fell away completely, revealing the cold-blooded killer beneath. You have no idea what you're destroying, she spat at Alexander. This kingdom needs strong leadership, not weak-hearted idealists who care more about peasants than power. Then it's a good thing you'll never rule it, Alexander replied quietly. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of crimes. The evidence Isabella had gathered, combined with testimony from co-conspirators seeking leniency, painted a picture of corruption that shocked the kingdom. Money stolen from the people was recovered and returned to its intended purposes. Hospitals were built, schools were funded, and the poor finally received the aid that had been to them for so long. Alexander stood in the palace garden 6 months later, beside Isabella's memorial rose garden, reading aloud from a letter he would never send, but needed to write. The roses were in full bloom, their crimson petals catching the afternoon sunlight like drops of wine. "My dearest Isabella," he read softly, "justice has been served. Will spend the rest of her life in prison, as will those who helped her. Our people are finally getting the help they deserve. I know you can't hear me, but I hope somehow you know that your sacrifice was not in vain. Your courage saved not just me, but our entire kingdom. I will love you always, and I will spend every day of my reign trying to be worthy of the gift you gave us all." As he folded the letter and placed it among the roses, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced since Isabella's death piece. The truth had been painful, devastating even, but it had also set him free. His wife's final act of love had not just exposed a killer. It had saved a kingdom and ensured that her memory would forever be associated with justice, courage, and the power of love to triumph over even the darkest evil.